this has been really interesting to talk about sort of your intellectual formation, and that early work from the 90s you guys were doing in New Zealand was actually influential on me. When the way in which you were using Foucault and writing about neoliberalism, that was quite useful for me as an early doctoral student. I just wanted to mention that. But in terms of sort of educational philosophy and theory today in this historical context, when I was driving my kids to school this morning, there was some news from New Zealand about anti-vaxxers chasing the prime minister. Yeah. And I thought that, that's sort of indicative of this moment we're living in, and I knew we'd be talking to you today. So this context of sort of the pandemic, the spread of conspiracy theories, irrationalism in societies, here in the Civil War, here in America, we daily talk about the sort of impending Civil War. And I'm wondering, sort of given this historical context that we live in, and also, your specific kind of intellectual formation and concerns, what you think the sort of role and purpose or possibility and limitations of sort of educational philosophy is right now, today?
Well, I think you hit the mark straight off, because I say, educational philosophy and theory, one of its targets has got to be conspiracy theory, because that's a kind, let me put it that way, that is a kind of virus as well, a viral system, a meme viral system, which is damaging to public health. It's damaging to people's mental health. And, when you have in New Zealand, never known for it, protesters threatening to kill the prime minister, right? Then you can see the influence of Trumpism and of the 36,000 lies that he told in the last year, and the way he pumps out, what I call it conspiracy, government by conspiracy. So Foucault, is some classic here, because he's really, his concept of biopolitics, is an approach that I follow. And, I think it's, it has been elaborated by a lot of other people as well, who are sympathetic, more or less, to Foucault. I think that's a fundamental approach. And I think that, for educational philosophy could do a lot worse than to embrace a biopolitical approach to pandemic, to big pharma, to big pharma capitalism, to the conspiracy through which the far right, who are now in power, are trying to govern, and to govern through fear, through anxiety, through violence, by activating a kind of fascist personality. So, that's the problematic. And I think that approach from biopolitics, particularly focusing on the immuno state, but also on conspiracy. This is the thing about conspiracy. You can't change it by providing facts, by facts. You can't change it by argument. So, educationally, it presents you with a problem. How do you deal with it? And particularly, how do you deal with it in class when there's a whole lot of stuff going on in the heads of young students, who are exposed to these conspiracies, either, from their own families and religion. I'm thinking about evangelical Christianity, who thinks that, the God has visited this pandemic on us because we are sinful. That's a big deal for young kids to deal with. And I think that, educational philosophy has got to be able to free that up in some way. Now, I don't think it's, primarily an epistemological project, but it is a political one.
So could you talk a little bit about how a biopolitical analytics and understanding can help open up? So, I mean, what I'm hearing a little bit is, on one hand, biopolitics is being useful for understanding this constellation of, I think you said, sort of big pharma and conspiracy and the far right. It opens up a set of metaphors and ways of thinking that draw links together between these perhaps seemingly disparate things. But then linking it to sort of classroom and more practical aspects of dealing with the cultural war context in the classroom. How does it become sort of useful there? I'm curious.
Well, I mean, in the United States at the moment, some states have passed legislation against critical race theory.
I was going to mention that too.
Yeah, right, so
especially you can't even talk about systemic racism. Right. Passing that legislation too.
Absolutely, and this is what do you say? Well, let me provide a broadside here, because we're talking about white supremacist far right thinkers who are trying to ban critical race theory because, and they're trying to do voter suppression, and they're trying to change voting laws, and they're trying to stop blacks from protecting themselves or from mass voting, because the black lobby, the black electorate really turfed, were largely responsible for turfing Trump out of power. They know that's a political force that they've got to neutralize. Now, in my view, the biopolitical approach here shows how important historically eugenics and white supremacism is. It's a biological sort of kind of entity, and and biological, and I say biological politics is involved here very strongly. I want to relate that back to genocide and to the history of the 20th century. And I think that's a very powerful theme on which to extemporize in terms of biopolitical approach. But also, you've got to say, when you go to look at the literature in viral theory, on the one hand, you kind of have a view which is based on the individualist approach to the cell, to the cellular organism. And now what we're seeing in viral theory is a kind of understanding much more of a community, a biological community here. So, I'm not thinking necessarily of a slavish adherence to biopolitics, but I'm thinking about ways in which we might use it as a understanding for viral theory. And for, let's say, not only viral theory, because if you go into the literature and you see the kind of changes of approaches from a kind of Western individualist self-concept of the cell to something which is kind of like much broader in terms of community, then you also have the trope that now we see being acted out in the nation state, with people who are willing to see that vaccination is not only a self-protective but a protection for others. And the anti-vaxxers are those people who still selfishly want to insist on it, individual rights, or particularly individual concepts of freedom, and they seem to have difficulty grasping the argument, the community argument, which is part of biopolitics.
But it's actually it's just a different form of community. It's an exclusionary community, which is based on contestations over the nation and the state, and who belongs and who doesn't. And that to me goes back to eugenics and fascist movements, and particularly fascist nationalisms, which are really at stake in these educational conversations about critical race theory. It's a forced assimilation to particular cultural ideas about the nation and who belongs, and it's very much rooted in biology. I mean, these right wingers don't want to think or at least admit that they think that way, but it's very clear that that's part of it. And then on the other side, you have like you were saying, the sense that I get vaccinated not just for myself, but to protect others as well. Another side that wants to at least try and retain some sense of solidarity in a society where everything is collapsed into the private, where the social itself has really become, collapsed into the private in so many different ways because of the, neoliberal transformations and so on. So that's very interesting. I'm still wondering at the level of like sort of the classroom, how is it a matter of having these conversations and building these forms of analyses into conversations, or is it more like teachers being aware themselves of these, becoming better aware of how these formations are operating in the context they're in, so that they can navigate the tensions with sort of a sense of expertise, or what? I'm curious.
Yeah, in the classroom, I mean, I think we need to have a nuanced educational philosophy towards concepts of complexity and ecological systems. And, at one level, that is biological, and we need to know something about ecological collapse of ecosystems per se that can be affected, by global warming, the relationship between global warming on the one hand and pandemics on the other, the way in which the Amazon is being cut down, the notion of the wild and the natural is being encroached upon, a whole bunch of kind of elements there, and so there's a curriculum based around ecological concepts, such as ecological, collapse, resilience, non-linearity. There's a whole bunch of concepts there, but I think one of the major ones is the relationship between stability on the one hand and complexity on the other, and how you understand that. Now, I think it's a huge topic, but I think there is a kind of curriculum, let me say, which is sensitive to the not just maintenance and protection of ecosystems locally, what I call it a critical eco-regionalism, because the students themselves have got to be involved in understanding their own local ecosystems. And that means at the viral level as well, because here in New Zealand, we saw the first form of colonization here was the importation of old world pathogens that killed Māori in huge numbers by by the beginning of the 1900s, though they were seen as a dying race, but that was all done at the level of the micro, the old world pathogens were brought in, and it just, smallpox and measles and influenza just kind of bowled them over, killed them in large numbers. And the other thing, of course, is the other part of imperialism, which you can see in terms of biological analogy, I think, is the way that Western imperialism and Western neoliberalism have attacked, so many countries from Vietnam, Libya, Yemen, now Syria and so on, where the biological now is the mass human migration with, 50 million people, permanent refugees, migrants moving from one part of, the Middle East and North Africa into Europe. This is also one needs to understand by migration, and this kind of logic of mass human migration is part of that same model.